Greetings of the day. I'm Amit Dogra, research intern at the ICS, and I welcome you all to another edition of ICS Wednesday seminar. Today's Wednesday seminar is titled China in Soviet Lithuanian Children's Periodical. And this seminar is based on Dr. Simonson's postdoctoral research project focusing on the representation of China in several Soviet Lithuanian children's magazines and newspapers. The speaker will elaborate on the nature and the challenges of examining the unexpectedly vast amount of primary material and dwell on the current political challenges of working with Soviet period sources. Dr. Simonson's research project intends to uncover the complexities of Soviet Lithuanian children's visual culture. It would reveal, among other things, the representation of Chinese history, culture, and people in the context of related research on children's literature, theater, and film, linking with Soviet ideology and geopolitical interest underlying the fraternity of peoples. It would also offer possible hypotheses with regard to the origin of present-day manifestation of racism. The research is developed at the intersection of ideologised Soviet children's culture and post-colonial theory. Let me introduce the speaker. Dr. Karina Simonson is an art historian and interdisciplinary scholar focusing on cultural connection between Baltics and Global South in the 20th and 21st century. Currently, she is a postdoctoral fellow at Vilnius Academy of Arts, working on her first monograph, provisionally titled Representations of Africa and Asia in Soviet Lithuanian Children's Visual Culture from 1945 to 1990. Origins, Influences, Circulation, and After Effects. She also teaches a unique course titled Africa and Asia Encounters, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives at the Institute of Asian and Transcultural Studies in Vilnius University. Her main research interests include the cultural production of Eastern European African diaspora, Africa and Asia cultural connections, South African Jewish history and culture, questions of academic positionality, cultural appropriations, and race and racism in the Baltics. Dr. Simonson holds an MFA from the University of Cape Town and a PhD in art history and criticism from the Lithuanian Cultural Research Institute. Today's seminar is chaired by Dr. Hemant Adlaka, who is a Vice Chairperson, Honorary Fellow of the ICS, and an Associate Professor at the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Dr. Adlaka's areas of research include political and foreign policy discourse in the PRC and modern Chinese literature and culture. He is a member of International Editorial Committee, International Society for Lushan Studies, Seoul, Republic of Korea. His articles have appeared in China Report, The Diplomat, Japan Times, Encyclopedia of Race and Racism, second edition, Washington, etc. His co-translation of Lushan's prose poetry collection from Chinese into Hindi has been published by the NBT in November 2019. Before I hand over to the chair, there are some housekeeping rules that need to be followed during the seminar. All participants will be muted during the seminar. Questions can be posted in the chat box, or you can use the raise hand option to during the question and answer session. You will be called upon by the chair to unmute yourself. I would now like to hand over the floor to Dr. Hemant Adlaka to take the proceedings further. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Amit. As chair to today's Wednesday seminar, I welcome you all, and especially I welcome Dr. Karina Simonson for this very fascinating and exciting theme, which is rather unusual perhaps for most of us. So at the very outset, as I thank ICS for inviting me to chair this session, I must also confess that I think I'm not at all competent to be actually chairing this session, and your guess is as good as mine that I mean, what could have been the reason I was asked to chair this session? Perhaps because as we have just heard in the introduction, Dr. Simonson has a very wide range, in fact, a breathtaking range of themes and issues which is currently part of her research or ongoing research, and which somewhere also touches upon racism. So I was wondering whether, not in a very distant past, I did contribute an essay in the Encyclopedia of Race and Racism, and my essay was on Confucianism from its origins and evolution, and the Confucianism as it is present in the Chinese society today. So perhaps that was the link of racism, which perhaps qualifies me to be sitting in the chair seat. Anyway, without taking much of everybody's time, let me make a brief observation. As we all know now, the topic which has been announced is really very wide-ranging and maybe very unconventional to some of us, but at the same time, very exciting and fascinating topic. I was particularly intrigued by looking at the abstract where it is mentioned about the intersection between Soviet ideology and the post-colonial theory or post-colonialism. Because in my limited understanding, post-colonialism on the one hand attempts to replace the colonial meta-narratives and tries to rewrite history by asserting cultural identities of the colonized and the marginalized through strategies such as nativism, hybridity, cultural syncretism, etc. And on the other hand, post-colonialism, backed by an anti-essential notion of identity and culture, critiques cultural hierarchies, particularly the Eurocentrism of modernity. At another level, likewise, I find it also very intriguing that Dr. Simonson tries to locate the main theme of her research, as I mentioned earlier, at the intersection of the Soviet ideology and post-colonial theory. I find it intriguing because, as I understand or look at it, the post-colonial critical narrative is specifically aimed at deconstructing continuing colonial or neo-colonial domination and the Western hegemony. So that is why I find it intriguing, because I'm not able to very clearly comprehend or understand where is the topic leading us to. So I think the best thing is, without further ado, let us listen to and perhaps solve this mystery to the guest today, Dr. Karina Simonson. So floor is yours. You may speak for 35 or 40 minutes, and then we can go into a question and answer session. Okay.
Yes. Sorry. Okay. Good afternoon for all of you who are watching and listening. I am excited and terrified at the same time. First of all, a lot of thank yous. The first one goes to Veda Vaidyanathan. I'm not sure, I hope I say it correctly, who invited me, who connected me to the Institute, who I met just accidentally during the research in Harvard, or in Princeton in University. So she was really kind connecting me. And then next goes to Rija, who organized the whole lecture, and to you, Professor, for chairing this. As I understand, it's not really that close to your own research, but I'm very happy that you decided to chair. And to Amit, who introduced me, and to a few more people who, for their input, for all the organizing and all the logistics. So yes, so let's then start. Okay, so to start with, it's sveiki. It's in Lithuanian, means hello. So it just, once again, I'm really happy to be here.
Sveiki, yeah.
Yes. Okay, so I'll start a bit with the prehistory, as I call it. So as Professor mentioned, this lecture is a part of my postdoctoral research, which is a much bigger one, which sounds like representations of Africa and Asia in Soviet Lithuanian children's culture. Soviet means 95, 1919, origins, influences, circulations, and after effects. So here I am presenting China. It's actually for the first time when I do it on a specific country. Usually I do it on the whole global south meaning in this case, Africa and Asia. And I use usually comparative approach. I did a bit of presentations and lectures on the presentation of Africa as a whole continent in children's visual culture, but I never did before a separate country. So it's like a disclaimer. So I will be really looking forward for your comments and advices, or maybe some really interesting discussions. Because as China, as you'll see later, I will show you some numbers. So China is the biggest chunk of specific country material in the whole material on Africa and Asia. So it does deserve a separate lecture, obviously, but I haven't done that before. Okay, so now, yes, so talking about the sources and geographies. So here to start with, so I'm looking at, first of all, Lithuanian children's periodicals, so newspapers and magazines from 1945, 1919, so till the date then Lithuania became independence. So the whole Soviet occupation period of 49 years. So here are some of the titles. So it's altogether 13 magazines and newspapers, but I'm looking not only in Lithuanian, so mostly it's Lithuanian. So Lietuvos pionierius, Moksleivis, Jaunimo Gretos, a few of them are in Lithuanian. Then I'm also interested in the Baltic context because, there's 3 small Baltic countries. So it's really useful and relevant actually to see what's going on around us. So I'm looking into Latvian and Estonian magazines and newspapers of the same period. And I'm adding also the newspapers and magazines for children in Russian who were circulated, in the whole Soviet Union. So they were circulated in Lithuania as well. So I don't know, for those of you who understand where are Cyrillics, so like Pionierskaya Pravda would be a Russian one, Murzilka will be a Russian one. So those are the 13 titles that I'm looking at. And yes, I did look through all of them. And this is if we talk about material by country, by geography, by the continents. So Asia is taking much more than Africa. So you see, it's more than twice. Then if we look by the country, so yes, as we see, China is more than a half of that of the Asia. If we look into the Asia, so China will be 54, then Vietnam will be in the second place, then India, Japan, actually is very little of Japan, which I wasn't expecting before I started the research. And there is also a lot of other Asian countries which will be represented maybe in just 1 or 2 illustrations, but it will be almost like all of them. We'll have Laos, Nepal, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Korea, Malaysia, Mongolia, Indonesia, Philippines, Pakistan, and you name it, which was also quite a bit surprising. Because, Lithuania is a small country, so to get the material about, countries we actually didn't have almost any connection was interesting and nice that at least something was there. Okay, now, talking about the chronology, like the time frame. So as I said, I'm looking into the Soviet period, which is 45 to 90. But there are also some peaks of, when we had a lot of those illustrations coming. So some of them are very regular. So let's say if you look into Indian representation, it will be from 95 till 90. It will be more or less like few here, few there, more or less. There were no peaking, actually, that it's stable, it's regular. The same with Korea, which is a bit surprising because I thought we will have more attention to Korea War, but it wasn't. There were just at that time, those illustrations were representing the war, but nothing else. There were no more of them at that time. But with China and Vietnam, there is obvious peaks, really, you can see them easily. So in China, it will be 93 and 53 and 59. So 59 is like the 10th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, and we had quite a lot of material of, congratulating the country. But what happened in 53, I'm not sure. I couldn't really trace. I hope you'll help me. Or I don't know why the 53, I still don't know it. Let's say that. Let's put it in this way. I don't know why it was so really highlighted. And with Vietnam, it's also more obvious. The Vietnam War, it's probably a lot, or let's say the biggest part of the illustrations were dedicated to Vietnam War. And yes, with China, as Rija asked me before the lecture, it's actually finished with the Sino-Soviet split. So it's only this first, it even didn't start from 45, it started from 50. So it's only like a bit more than 10 years, right? And that's it. And then in 67, I will show that there was just a couple of illustrations, and that's it. Then the next 30 years, there is nothing. So it was like, that's it. So that's yeah, and Vietnam didn't end it. I mean, Vietnam also before and that time, we did have some illustration. That was just the peak when it was most of them. Now now talking, I wanted just to show you some examples of literature that I'm using. So as you see, it's not specifically on China or China representation or anything related specifically to that. As I said, I'm looking on overall. So my research is built on these few sets of scholarships, and in Soviet studies, we focus on the concept of so-called Soviet internationalism, based on the ideas of the global friendship of people, which included African and Asian representations. So Soviet studies were always a hot topic to study, especially for the Western scholars. But the war in Ukraine highlighted the relevance of the colonial discourse even more than before, and forced me to move away from the Moscow-centered approach, which was quite popular in some circles, and helped me to actually ground my research in the Baltic context, which otherwise probably I wouldn't think about because it's quite small, and we're used to think that it's copy-paste from Moscow. So whatever we have in the previous, like in the former Soviet republics, will be kind of like a bad copy of the Moscow. But it's actually not. When I started to look, I mean, on some parts it is true, but other half is not. So when I started to look closer into Latvian and Estonian context and the illustrations, yes, I don't understand the language, but illustrations, I don't need the language. So because our cultures are different, even if it's a small countries, religions are different. It means like Lithuanians are Catholics, while Estonians will be Protestants. So the cultures are different, and it means this sense of humor is different. And sense of humor is very important in children's illustrations. And then you see it's different. The approach to the subject is different. So it's quite difficult for me to show, specifically, because also sense of humor is very subjective, right? So, but there are quite a lot of differences. Also for example, in Estonian illustrations, they have a much wider range from very, very conservative representation, or let's put it in another word, very racist, to very liberal, to very, they have like nude acts in their youth magazines of like Japanese nude acts. Like, I mean, we couldn't imagine that in Lithuanian magazines at that time. So comparing to Estonian, Lithuanian illustration is much more conservative. We have, on one hand, it's good. We have less quite racist and stereotypic representations, but we also don't have much really interesting and beautiful ones. So what I also wanted to do, there is another popular stream of research, which I hope to avoid. So besides the grounding in the Baltic context, which is very important for me, but also we hope to avoid this flattening, not only the Baltics, but the whole Eastern Europe as one homogeneous region, which also unfortunately does happen in academia. So by focusing on the impact of Soviet ideology within children's educational material, this research will nuance how one Baltic state absorbed, produced, and conflicted with other iterations. So here, just going back to that list of the literature, not lists, just a few examples of those works that I find really important for my study. So, for example, the first one, it's one of the major work providing a broad history of the relationship between Eastern Europe and the decolonizing world, which is collectively written monograph, Socialism Goes Global, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in the Age of Decolonization. So it actually overturns this long-standing assumptions about a monolithic or closed-off Eastern Bloc. I think I'm not going now into more details into every book that I mentioned, but if some of you would want to, I'm happy to share and more of them. Oh, and the two last ones, it's more specific ones. So the Pia Koivunen, she's talking about this World Youth Festival, where the youth had this chance to meet live. And the last one is one of the major work on the depictions of the communism for children, which for me, because I'm working specifically with children's material, is really important. Okay. Now, first to set the stage for the illustrations or how the kids could see or imagine the world through illustrations, I first would like to talk about the actual encounters that were possible at that time. So the actual personal encounters that were available, open for adults and for children. So, sorry. So this Soviet internationalism was maintained in several ways, and one of them was travels to various African, Asian countries. So there were a few types of those travels. First were the official visits of Communist Party members to different countries. Then there were culture workers' travels, like writers' travels, but often they went together with these official delegations. Then there were scientists and travelers who were lucky to get out and publish their memories on return. Then there were actually fishermen. That was one of the ways for Lithuanians to travel and to see the world. So sometimes if you're a doctor, you could get employed on this ship, on this fishing big ship who were going in the ocean. And they had stops in different countries, like in African countries or in others, and they could see a bit of a bigger world. So the doctors would work on this ship, or it mostly was doctors, but also journalists and other professions. And then we had the reciprocal African and Asian delegations coming to Lithuania or to other Soviet Republic. So also that was a chance for local Lithuanians to meet live with people from Africa and Asia. So, for example, this picture is from 1955, when one of our famous writers, Antanas Venclova, he traveled to China. And after that, he published some stories in children magazine. In this case, this is Genys, Lithuanian Children Magazine. And he also wrote a story, like his travel memoir, Travel in China. But actually this history, some of those trips, or let's say most of those trips, were not mentioned in these people official biographies. So it's not that easy to trace. So first, for example, in this case, I trace the illustrations in the magazines and then the story in the magazine, and then I try to find when they go, with whom they go, what was the story of their travel. It's not like it's easy available to see that, then 55 he traveled to China and then 56 he traveled to India. It's not. So that was, I think, the first illustrations that I found of China in our children's magazines. I think so, but we'll see it later. So it's one of those writer's travels. Then, Then also, as I mentioned, so culture workers travels, not only writers, but also artists traveled. So that is one of this case. So this is 59, and that's Sergejus Grachovas. He traveled to China, and then he illustrated the same magazine Geni. So he kind of told about his memories about China, but in pictures this time. So like in this case, the artist who drew those pictures, she didn't travel to China. She illustrated the story of the writer who traveled. And in this case, the artist himself traveled. Sorry. And that's another case in another magazine. Also, the artist traveled to China, and then he came back and he draw those illustrations. Then maintaining cultural and cultural connections was also very important. So this is the examples that I found from the magazines and newspapers of the Chinese theater visits in Lithuania. This is 56 and 57. So that's a Chinese artist in Lithuania, the title. So these connections, these encounters also happened. Then another type of, well, let's say, very popular way of making international friends in Soviet Lithuania was finding a pen pal. So the pen pal, I don't know, for those of you, I don't know, who don't know, that's to find a pen pal, it's to find a child with whom one becomes friendly by exchanging letters, especially someone in a foreign country whom one has never met. And usually those addresses of those pen pal addresses were found in the local newspapers or at school. And they existed, or they have also, we also had this international friendship clubs. So, for example, these two examples that I found, that I present specifically on having pen pal in China, which I found, the first one is from 55, and this is not just the letter itself, but it's a story about the boy who wrote to the school in one of the towns in Lithuania. He wrote in Chinese, and the stories in the story you can read that nobody could understand. So they actually sent the letter to Moscow, to the anti-fascist committee or club or something. Anti-fascist, don't see it now. Yeah, committee, like youth anti-fascist committee to translate. It's I don't know, it probably doesn't mean that we didn't have at all anybody who will understand Chinese. That's not for me to tell now, but that's what they did. And then so they got the letter translated, and there is a boy from Canton, I think, yeah, which is Guangzhou now, and he wants to meet friends in Lithuania. So the how it works, usually they were writing to somebody in the school. They didn't know in the beginning the specific name. They were just saying, let's say, one that's a letter to the boy or girl, let's say the 5th grade, whose surname will start with, I don't know, letter S or something. So like really random choice. So this is the first, and then the second is also a pen pal letter, also actually from Canton, from Guangzhou, but this time it was written in Russian because the boy is studying Russian, and because he wants to go to study in Moscow. So that was another letter written to the girl in Vilnius school. But also he wrote like to random person saying that please give this letter to the person who is in the school list number 11. So that was this girl named Bajana, and you see the picture of her very happy. She's showing the letter to her friend. Next. Okay, just connect, not directly, but connected, related to this post and mailing pen pal experience. This is the collecting of post stamps were very popular all over the Soviet Union. So that is the advertisement in one of our magazines for the collection of Chinese post stamps. So you can, it says that you can buy them, different post stamps. So not only Chinese, there is other ones, but there's also the Chinese ones. Yeah, that was advertisement in the 55 in one of the magazines. Okay, now I'll discuss like the main topics which I found while researching the illustrations. So probably the biggest part will be connected to the historical political events. And this illustration is generally, just if going back, I remember that my research is on Africa and Asia, like generally. So there were quite a lot of different political and historical events represented. So you can see, as I mentioned already, like Korea and Vietnam War, it was quite heavily represented. So let's say the whole September issue of 68 of magazine Guinness was dedicated to Vietnam, the whole issue. So, and inside were many stories about Vietnamese struggle against the French colonizers and the capitalist Americans and the two Vietnams, like the good and the bad. And at the end of the main story, like the good Soviet children extend the helping hand and write. We live in Soviet Lithuania. It feels nice and fun. Today we have learned a great deal about your country, and now we love you even more, especially the partisans who heroically fight against the Americans. We'll send you our creative works and drawings as gifts. So Vietnam was popular. Then also, let's say, talking just at least a bit about Africa. So the issue of 61, the June issue of 61 was dedicated to Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba. He was actually very popular in the Soviet Union, and not just this illustration, but in 60, it started from like 60, first about his fight, then about his death, and then about his orphan children, and then about other fighters and activists in Congo. So it was a lot of, I mean, if I would talk about Africa, the Congo will be one of those countries which were very popular. And really, it was a lot illustrations about this. So just in other words, many different political and historical events were represented in those children magazines. But talking about China specifically, also quite a lot of them. Just a minute, sorry. So a lot of those images on China were representing, or let's say, introducing socio-political changes in the country. So a lot of them about building, about learning, about studying, about fighting. What else we see here? Yeah, about demonstrations, again, yeah, building. Or this is the article called China Today. Again, industry, building, yeah, in a lot of industry or education, or yeah. This also, the article talking about the socialist way is the best way. This type of illustrations. Then, as I mentioned, there were only 2 articles after the Sino-Soviet split, or not articles, but illustrations. We're not talking about articles, illustrations. So this is 67. So in 2 magazines, only 2. So that was about on Cultural Revolution. It's actually, there's how the situation changed and how sad. And then you see on the one on the right, the title is in the quotes, and it's called Perfect Situation, but kind of opposite, right? Because it's in the quote. Yeah, so it's a lot of critique and yeah. But you see the illustrations are already different. Not a happy, not happy building of the country, the new country. And there was also a few specific issues that the illustration represented. So let's say there was one on Tibet. Not one, there's few. I mean, I just give you 2 examples. So there was stories and illustration about Tibet that, let's say, for example, the one on the left is saying that that it is now a part of the China's People's Republic, and how the things changed to the better, and there is now much more schools than it was before, and so on and so forth. Then this is about a Japanese invasion in Manchuria. So there also was pictures and articles about that. There were also, I think, quite a few on Taiwan. And I think I even saw one on Uyghurs. Yeah, so you can see even like specific political topics that were presented, which is a bit weird because it's still children magazines, right? It's not a political or any kind of just for the adults audience. It's a kids magazines, but there were some like different or various topics. Okay, then another very important aspect is the friendship of people, which was one of the most important, let's say probably one of the most important aspects of Soviet Union's soft power, is the ideology of the friendship of people. And there were plenty of those illustrations, most of them featuring few or many or several different races, different ethnic groups, children. Usually it was free, but you could see like on the right, there could be more on them. And often they would also feature a white dove as a symbol of peace. But you could also find some dedicated only to Soviet Union and China friendship, like these 2. So the one is actually they both are the covers of the magazines, just of the different magazines. And also the doves are popular. Sorry, am I going too fast or it's okay?
It's okay, Karina, yeah.
Okay. Because sometimes I tend to speak too fast, so I'm just double checking. Thank you. Okay, so these were the specifically Chinese focused. Chinese culture were also represented, but it was mostly literature, not just even literature, it was folk tales, like folk stories. So there were quite a lot of this fairy tales, I don't know what's the correct word in English, with illustrations like this one, and that one. Oh, this one. Yeah, this was quite a lot of them of that type. And only one, it's even, I don't know if I could count it even as one, where it's a bit more than just literature, but there is some, as you see, you can do a toy or a doll, or you can, I don't know, it's still, I mean, there is nothing else beside the fairy tales about Chinese culture. So that was a bit surprising because there were a lot of illustrations, a lot of materials, but it was mostly fairy tales or like some stories. Then going next, what was also popular is to to express the friendship of people through the alphabet or through the importance of education. So, like importance of education, bringing or the building a bright socialist tomorrow. So, as you see, this is a cover of Guinea's magazine, and on the right side there is the children of different races, and it's the letters. It's maybe not that easy to understand, but A is for Africa, that's clear. That's but the other ones, I think the K is for Kenya, which Kenya in Lithuanian means China. And the other one, E, is for India. You see where the kids are standing and touching the letter. And the T at the top right corner is T. It's for Tarybų Lietuva. Tarybų means Soviet. So it's also not that easy to understand if you don't know the language. So we had this type of cover. Then education was very popular in illustration on China. So you could see many of them featuring Chinese children learning, studying, reading. Yeah, like this ones as well. That's a cover of the magazine. Oh, this one. Then the closely connected theme is to the education is the theme of the happy childhood, happy Chinese children, or the happy childhood. So in most of them, not most, in all of them, you will see the Chinese happy kids. If it's not about the adults, then the kids will be this idealized childhood. Actually, the one on the right side, it's because it's here, it was the same spread, so I left it here. So it's about two Indian girls who were studying in Moscow and for 2 years, and now they're coming back to India, and they were writing a letter how their time went in the Soviet school. Because before, in few issues, they had this story about these two, Monisha and Shamita, who were studying in Moscow, and how they saw the snow, how they met the friends, and how they learned the language. It was the whole another story. And now it's the end of the story, so they're leaving and they're saying goodbye, and how they're happy and they miss their friends. But most important, how happy was the time in the Soviet Union for them. Yeah, that's another type of the happy kids. But you see, in this one, it was also because now I'm doing lecture on China, so I didn't put actually any others. Will be together with other countries, but this is one of the examples. It was quite popular to put China, India, and Japan in one. So this one is about how the new school year begins in different countries. So the one is in India, what kids do, bringing flowers and whatever. And in Japan, when it starts, when it's the cherry blossom, and then in China, how they go to school, how they celebrate the beginning of the new school year. How I'm doing with the time, sorry.
Karina, I think you will have to wrap up in the next couple of minutes.
Yeah, I think I'm actually coming to the conclusions.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, there is just one last example that they were also publishing illustrations or works by Chinese artists. So there is two examples. There is the one picture and then the poster, Chinese poster in the magazine. And they're also sometimes publishing drawings by Chinese children and Lithuanian children, like on one thread on different topics. So, yeah, so I have some, it's really tentative conclusions because I would prefer to have the final ones when I have the whole picture, not just, the Africa and Asia, because that's my goal, not the separate ones, but that's what I have now, if we talk specifically about China. So yes, as it's obvious, the strong influence of politics. It's the friendship of people. If you see if you look at the photos, at the photographs used, you'd be a lot you'll see of guns and fights and industry, building roads. So building roads to again bright socialist future, and that it's all ended with Sino-Soviet split again. Just says how much it was connected to the politics, like. Any other countries we still keep, besides any, the relations between Soviet Union and other countries could also change, nothing was stable at the time, but we didn't have any other case which, it would end representation in the magazines. No, it could become less or more, it would just changing, but still would have something, but not in the case of China. Then I should say very selective representations. Maybe I might not show you everything, but generally there is quite just few topics, few themes that the illustration was on, and they were quite selective. And then yes, as I stressed, it's very idealized childhood with this stress on education and learning and books. There is almost, if you see the illustrations of kids, there is almost nothing else they were doing. They were only studying, learning and reading. So yes, I think that's it. Thank you. And now I'm waiting for the questions and for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina. So I was just informed by Dr. Adlakha that there's a major power failure at his place. So he's unable to join the meeting. So I would be taking over the Q&A on his behalf. Karina, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I think without much further ado, I think we'll begin the Q&A. We already have a few questions in the chat box, so I think we can take it one by one. Is that fine?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. All right. So we have a question from Sugandha. Sugandha, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. My first question is there any difference between the visuals of China today, or China Reconstruct as it was called during that time, circulated within China, and the ones which were published for foreign consumption?
Sorry, if I understand correctly, you have two questions, right? First, about the difference of representation.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I can't tell you because I'm not looking into the current representation. I stop at 1919 when Lithuania became independent, because that will be completely different. I mean, it's something else started. So I'm looking into the Soviet people, because I didn't mention in the beginning why actually I'm doing that. So I'm looking into representations of in the children magazines, because most of the active citizens which we have today in Lithuania, who are forming the politics, they were born, or they were born and they were growing up during those times. So they were influenced by these magazines, because I'm looking in the whole postdoc, it's not only the magazines and not only the illustrations, but also cartoons, all the children visual culture. So the theater plays, the children's movie, cartoons, toys, what you can think, everything what you can think about. So I'm looking how this visual culture influenced kids at that time. So now when they grew up, how they, you know, how they participate in the racial conversation, because, you know, that's a lot of what you do now. It's influenced by your childhood, by, you know, what you saw, what you heard, what you were told, you know, that other people looks like or do, or, you know. So that's why I'm interested in this specific period, not in the what happened after after independence. Sorry, and what was the second question?
Sukunda, are you there?
Yes. Methodologically, as art historians, what alternative methodological approaches you can think we can adopt other than categorizing all the data according to major historical and political periods?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. Thank you for that, because as I work with the yeah, first I have to make it clear that I'm basically the first one in the country who is doing this type of research. Mostly our art history is very much Eurocentric, unfortunately. So either we work, or other historians work with specific Lithuanian history, you know, art history, artworks, or it can be some neighboring country like Poland or the same Russia, or, you know, still Eastern Europe, or even the whole Europe. But we don't have instruments or experience or literature or, you know, anything to work with the art coming from Africa and Asia, unfortunately. So, for example, when I did my doctoral dissertation was on South African Jewish photography. So it was, again, I had to work with the South African context with apartheid, being kind of the first one. So now I came back to, so there I was working on connections between Lithuanian Jews and Africans, the subjects of their photography. And now after the PhD, I came back to, you know, in my postdoc, I'm back to Lithuania. So I'm working here, but I still look at the connections, right, between the Lithuania and the Africa and Asia. So between the different races, different cultures, so we don't really have that. So I have to adopt different approaches. So sometimes I have to read, like when I work, I did say that a bit before the lecture, I have a lot of, in Lithuanian museums and in Estonian museums, we have quite a collections of Black toys, which is so unusual for us because we didn't really have colonies, right? We don't have that connections, we don't have that history, but we do have those toys, which were local grandmothers were knitting them. A lot of them are handmade. Some of them were produced in Moscow factories, they're different, but we had a lot of them handmade. Our grandmothers were knitting them for their kids. And what kind of examples they were using, hell's no. I mean, nobody knows. So when I try to research that and to analyze, if I use the American literature, they have a lot of right material on Black toys, Black dolls. It's a long history, but I can't just copy paste that. So I have to invent how to connect that to our own history, to our context, and that's a struggle. That's a constant struggle. I have to admit. So yes, again, going back to a question, a lot of that I have to combine, to invent something that and then to test if it works or it doesn't. So yeah, but thank you for the question.
Thanks, Karina. So we have another question, in fact, a bunch of questions from Ms. Cherry Hitkari. She's a research intern at the ICS. Cherry, you can unmute yourself and ask your questions. Let's begin with the first two questions and we can come back to you if we have more time. Cherry? Okay, I think I'll read out the questions for you, Karina.
Yeah, okay.
So her first question is, what do the periodicals tell us about the roles children were expected to play or how they were envisioned in the Soviet Union? Did you come across any regional differences in such roles? That's her first question.
Oh, wait,
Should
let me read it again. Yeah, I see it. Let me read it. Maybe. Regional in which sense? Between the different Soviet republics, or because Lithuania is small, there is no, I mean, we do have regions, but there is no such difference between them. Or if the question is about the Soviet Union republics, I'm looking only into the Baltic context. I mean, to look into the whole Soviet Union, that's wow, that's the work for the whole life, I think. So then I think, as I see, the children were seen as the, the most easy way for the propaganda to work. But I think that's not something specific to Lithuania. That's all around the world, that the kids are seen, as something that you can teach them whatever you want to. That's why it's so important for me, to do this research. I'll see how most of our adults, what they've got actually when they were kids, what kind of information or attitudes. Should they read the second question?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I think you can take that up.
Yeah, I actually don't know yet why the Vietnam War was much more covered than the Korean War. That actually surprised me, because in the beginning I thought it will be similar, but it wasn't. I mean, there was some on Korea, but like you can't compare. Vietnam was. So in some of the newspapers, there was the whole campaign to, if I remember correctly, because we have one campaign for Vietnam, one campaign for Congo, like huge, it was in the newspaper. And newspapers was like weekly newspaper. So it's like, so I think for Vietnam was collecting local herbs, like the medical herbs, to send to Vietnam, to the Vietnam hospital, if I'm correct. But like every issue, every week on the front page, I didn't put it here because there was actually no pictures. It's the text, but the campaign, it was a lot of like slogans. I think it was during the summer, so they were urging kids to collect herbs and to dry them, and then to bring to a specific point, and then they, as always, they were made kids to compete, who will bring more, which probably class or school, maybe be school, who will win, this context, this socialist, contest, and to send these herbs to Vietnam. I mean, so like with Congo, they were building the summer camp in Congo, one of the Congo cities next to the city, and they were collecting things. So they first were asking what the summer camp would need. What do you think? So they made a list. Like I think during the month, probably the kids were sending their letters, what is important in the summer camp. And the next in that campaign, the next step was actually to collect those things. So, which school will bring more. I think they have to bring money. So they had to, the usual way for kids to earn money was, for example, to collect paper, right? And to give paper that, used, I don't know what's the word in English, the used paper or glass, to this specific places, and then you can get some money. So then we had to collect money and to bring that money so they could buy stuff to send to Congo summer camp. Yes, but I don't know yet why. Sorry, going back to your question, why Vietnam was covered much more. If somebody has an insight, I'll be happy to hear. Yeah, so should I read the third one?
Yes, you can take up the third one. And then we have a raised hand from Dr. Anand Krishnan, and we can come back to him.
Yeah, there is a lot of that, of this notions of friendship in these illustrations, or in the. I try not to read the stories. I'm supposed to look on the illustrations, but they're so interesting, so it's important. It's impossible not to read. Yes, there were a lot of them of friendship, but I don't remember there was something like if it's elder brother, so like a younger brother. This I don't remember now if I saw such a term used. But the friendship, yes, for sure. Should I read next one?
Yes, Karina. Yeah. So it's on the methodology, I think. you
Yeah,
have
yeah. Well, I already
partially
answered that. I already
Yeah, you
answered.
partially answered it. Yeah, yeah. So I think, Karina, we can move on to Dr. Anand P. Krishnan. He has a raised hand. Anand, can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for that good presentation. In fact, a lot of rich visual material. I had just two questions. In fact, one was, I think in the conclusion, what you indicated on the Sino-Soviet split. And one of the earlier slides, you did talk about all these, because yours a much more larger study. But on the China front, you said this was peaking in, say, 58, 59. So one, does this actually stop after 59, or after the Sino-Soviet split, do Lithuanian literature stop depicting China in the magazines, or even in the stream of literature, or the wide range of literature you're actually talking about? Does depiction of China actually stop? If it doesn't, then does the split also have its impact on how China is depicted? In fact, is there a difference in the take from the earlier depictions, which in any case you are saying is very selective depictions, what happens? So is there a more subtle criticism of China even in some of those depictions? I would imagine this is still children's literature, children's magazines, and children's periodicals. But how is there a criticism of China? Does this come through in that sense? That's one. So that's one part of the question on how the Sino-Soviet split impacts depiction of China post in the 60s and then further on to 70s and in the 80s, of course, coming to the 90s. The other part, which I was interested, is because you said you're looking at this wide canvas of Africa and Asia. I was also wondering, from a comparative perspective, if you're looking at it, how is India depicted? I mean, is that selective representation of China, as you said, is that also applicable to India? How India is depicted in the literature in Lithuania? Apart from, of course, specific cultural and language and other diversity and other aspects, is there any common strands in how China and India is depicted in the literature, or what the Lithuanian children in that particular time period of the Cold War, their readings and their understanding of China and India through these images and through these rich visual culture, or even some of these stories and narratives? Is there any difference in both how India and China get represented or get disseminated in this literature? So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. I hope I'll remember everything which you asked. So the first one, I think I did mention, so after the Sino-Soviet split, everything stopped. There was only 2 illustrations in 67 across all the 15 magazines, which were talking about the Cultural Revolution. But that's it. Nothing. So I think the 62 it stopped. I think that was the last illustration, and then 60. So it was nothing. Then 67, just 2, and then that's it. There's 0, like nothing till the 90, like completely. So that's the first question. So I can't answer because there were nothing. And then talking about the second. I haven't done yet, comparing specifically China and India, which would be really nice and interesting to do. And probably I will do it at some point. But what I noticed with India, we have, first of all, this was constant interest, and the representation was more diverse, which I mean, that's what I remember. So it was more in different cultural aspects and political and different figures. There were articles and pictures of Mahatma Gandhi. There was like different, and even artists and writers, and it was more diverse. Probably less politics, more culture and history. But I mean, politics was also there, but I mean, I can't tell you now in detail. But it was more diverse, and it didn't stop. I think till the last issue, I'm looking like, I think still in 89, there was something on India. And it's also probably, or maybe because we had more connections with India, we had more people traveling to India. And as much as I remember, even from talking with my colleagues at the institute who are working with Indian studies, we had more like academic work on India from, we had much more longer connections than of studying India than China. I don't know why now, I can't answer you that question. But yeah, so it's more diverse, coming back to your question. But I would love to compare, the more in detail, more specific.
Thanks.
Mm.
Thanks, Karina. So over to the questions in the chat box. So I'll read it out for you. We have a question from Rohil Vaidya. He's asking, I had a question on the depictions of national differences in children's literature. Were there any obvious value judgments in the representation, either visual or textual, of children from various nations? Or were children treated as a universal youth with little consequence of national identity?
Sorry, where is that question? I'm trying to find it. Is it
right at the bottom?
the last one?
Second question. Yeah, the second last question from the bottom.
And the second last. Okay, let me see. You mean generally, right? Not just in Chinese children.
In general, I think. Yeah.
Oh, generally, because as I said in the beginning, I did much more research, or not research, presentation about Africa. So the major issue that's coming there, it's the image of poor black child. It's everywhere, unfortunately. So the black kids in banana skirts and with earrings, it's like half of all the pictures, unfortunately. So again, where it is coming from, it's another story. But so they were depicted either as the pioneers, of the shorts and the pioneer, all the stuff, or either going almost naked with banana skirt and earrings. So that was very strong. And actually this image, unfortunately, still traveled to this day. We still can find this representation of African children or Africans, unfortunately. In much less degree, but it still unfortunately happens from time to time. So that's one which comes to my mind probably the strongest. So talking about Africa, so this was very, very popular, this image, this stereotype, and then this separation between, again, I mentioned before the lecture, between bad capitalist and good socialist, good communist. So, it was presented like whatever would be the occasion, the New Year, the beginning of new school year, or the International Children's Day. It will be, the whole, like the nice pictures of singing and dancing Soviet pioneers or Soviet kids. It will be a color picture. And then on the other side of the spread of the magazine will be black and white photos of those kids sleeping on the ground and hungry, of all this, of no clothes. And that will be a story, something, not a story, but just a few lines saying like Happy New Year. For example, if it's like a December issue, Happy New Year, we wish you like a good celebration. We hope you'll get a lot of gifts and have enough time. But don't forget, but in some countries, kids will not celebrate. They will not get any gifts. They have to work because this bad capitalists, they make, even children to work. So don't forget about that. So this was very popular. This, separation, even visual, you don't even have to read. You'll see, what's going on. But it was even, stressed by, this few lines of don't forget, like you're the happy one, the lucky one. So that will be the second kind of very popular topic, popular theme. And
yeah, go ahead, Karina.
No, so I should say that probably with African, the visual stereotypes is much like way stronger than we look in like how the Asians are represented. With Japanese, you still sometimes can see, there is like a we have a bicycle company who at that time was selling bicycles all around the world, and they were really using friendship of people ideology for their advertising. So they will have on their ads, children of different from different countries riding the bicycles, and you'll find for sure that will be a naked black kid there, but the Japanese girl will be with kimono and with the parasol, like cycling, right? I mean, but just because if you're Japanese, you have to be depicted with the parasol, right? I mean, so with umbrellas. So I mean, but it's still comparing. It's much fewer of those that nonsense.
All right. So next we have a question from Arijit Banerjee. Arijit, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes.
you are.
Thank you, Dr. Simonson, for your wonderful presentation. My question is basically on the ideological representations that you get to see in children's literature in a very subtle manner, in how they are usually depicted with certain qualities and objects. As while you were responding to Rohil's question, you mentioned that how the Africa would be differentiated from the representation of Chinese children, and like my question sort of follows from that. Like in a way, how would this the ideological sentiments of nationalism and internationalism, as at that time you had a very starkly divided sort of a front of the third world theories of Mao. In that sense, how would the children's literature depict them visually? It's just a question whether I'd like to hear what you have found.
Sorry, I think I lost the you wrote your question, right? Is it the last question? Yeah, let me just read it. Sorry for a second, because I think I lost the sound at some point. So,
Karina, I can read it out for you. This is from
no, it's
Arijit
okay.
Banerjee.
It's okay. I can read it. Oh, was it a Moscow? Was it local? You see, I think we had already a similar question. I didn't study other republics if they had the same.
Karina, sorry. So that's not the question. The question is the one right before that, above that.
Before that. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. Okay. Different
the one
objects.
on capturing the nationalist and the international sentiments.
By different objects, what do you mean?
As in, for an example, how they would be depicted and stereotyped or represented. For an example, with let's say one with poverty would be depicted with certain objects and qualities, and the ones who are rich would be depicted with certain objects which would be represented in the painting, in that sense.
That's a very good question, but I didn't get to that detail yet talking about China, unfortunately, yeah, but if you already noticed something, I will be happy to hear that.
In a sense, when like when I was working on the representation of China in children's literature as how they came to Bengal, I found certain elements where different ethnicities were represented, as in Uyghurs, and how in a children's literature they were differentiated from, let's say, the other Han Chinese ethnicities would be represented. So this sort of sparked me this question, that if you have found children's literature or newspaper that sort of differentiates or adds nuance to various forms of representations.
That's a very good question, because thinking how huge is China, I actually didn't notice any difference, but it might be that I didn't notice because I'm not, my eye is not trained yet that well on Chinese representation. But there is one article I think I mentioned on Uyghurs, so there were photos, but other than that, I think it's more or less the same, at least to my eye. I might be wrong. Yeah, yeah, but then I probably have to take all the pictures one by one. I mean, to put them next to each other and see if, if I'm wrong or not. But as I remember, I think they're more or less similar representation of the whole, population.
Yeah.
If that was the question, sorry.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Dr. Simonson.
Thanks, Karina. Over to the next question. We have a question from Prabhat Kumar. His question is, was the selective representation in Lithuania orchestrated from Moscow, or was it a regional initiative? If from Moscow, the same pattern would be reflected countrywide. Have you studied the representation of other SSRs also from this point of view?
Okay, no, I didn't. As I said, I focus on Lithuania with some Baltic context, so I don't go to the other 12 republics. Definitely, there is some of them were copy-pasted from Moscow, and all those travels, they couldn't happen without Moscow. But you see, for example, with Africa, I was able to trace something in the 30s, some images that then I see have, the later visuals have similarities to the previous ones. But with the China, I couldn't find anything before even not 45 or 50 when they started, this that I showed you, that I could trace, that this was influenced by local sources, local artworks or something like that. But it might be that I didn't find, it's kind of not, my main focus, but yeah.
All right.
Yeah, but yes, for sure, there was a lot of Moscow initiative, or copy paste, whatever word you will use in that.
All right, Karina. So we have a raised hand from Professor Madhvi Tampi. Ma'am, can you please unmute yourself? I think you'll have to make a
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am, we can hear
Okay,
you.
okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you. I found this quite fascinating, this presentation. I just was curious whether your research also includes assessing the impact of these kind of visuals and this kind of portrayals of China and other countries on the youth or the young kids who read them. Because have you been able to conduct any interviews with people who grew up in that period to find out what they, whether it had any impact at all on them or any lasting impact?
I don't do like the oral history or the interviews. No, but I do trace, for example, if I see in the interview some mentioning of the name, so for example, this pen pulse or, whatever, there was a lot of names actually in all those magazines and newspapers. I do try to trace them. It's not that simple. So, to hear their stories, did they really travel to Congo, to, Vietnam or India? But I don't have now yet enough material to give you, the proper answer on that.
Thank you.
But for example, with representation, again, going back to Africa, I can see that in everyday, like let's say not every day, but like in media or because I also teach, and I can see what my students know about Africa and Asia, because my students, they're coming from China studies, India studies, Japan studies, Turkey. So I can see what they know. And kind of, especially when we talk about more broader questions, and some of them are really easy to trace to what they have learned in the childhood. I mean, they're actually younger than that, but it means that their parents teach them what their parents learned during the Soviet times, because these kids, they already grew up during independence. I mean, my students. So yeah, so it's sometimes, you hear the names, they sometimes say them, not unconsciously, but they first say them and they're like, oops, I just said that. And it's like, yeah, that's coming from here and there. And they're kind of aware that it's not a proper word to use now, or the proper name, but we discussed that openly during the lecture. But, I mean, for example, there was some cartoons about white kids traveling to Africa, and they meet their like African kids. It's very general. I mean, just African kids and, you know, probably Russian kids, and how this black kids, very, you know, like typical story that the Africans, they don't do nothing. They just sing and dance on the sun and eat bananas, right? And there is a name of those kids in the cartoon, in the animation, and then this name is still used. I can still hear that. So so I trace it in this way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think that's all the questions that we have in the chat box. Do we have any more questions? Any more raised hands? No. So in that case, Corinne, I would like to just add one more question from my side, because I think we have 5 more minutes to go.
Okay.
That's all right. I was just wondering, Karina, that, you know, that there has always been a strong Soviet influence on Chinese literature, society, culture, everything. So I was wondering that, you know, in terms of the general tropes that's being used in the illustrations in the Lithuanian children's literature, has there been a Chinese influence? Say, for instance, during the Mao period, strong Chinese women and girls were an important trope in the illustrations in the Chinese children's literature. So do you see such similar influences in terms of tropes that China uses in the literature? Because I think some of the photos, some of the illustrations that you shared, I noticed that, you know, that women and girls are definitely a recurring theme in the literature. So do you see some similar Chinese influence?
I think this women and girls, I think that was general during the Soviet time. This, you know, that that was on the surface, obviously, but, you know, the equality of the genders, you know, that. So I think that the representation was following that. Sorry, but I'm not sure that I understand your what the question.
No, basically in terms of the tropes, Karina, because you know, there has always been a strong Soviet influence in Chinese literature, you know, be it in terms of the revolutionary content, the Revolutionary Guards. So similar in terms of, you know, Chinese influence, because China had those children's magazines, right? Like the Little Red Guards, you know, that was targeted towards the primary school kids in China. So even in those magazines, you would see, you know, women and children as a general trope that occurs.
So you mean not the representation of China, but the actual influence, right?
Influence, yeah, not the representation, no.
That's a very interesting question. I don't think I have an answer to that. Because again, for that, I need to have both my feet in Chinese studies to actually see, you know, that. And I don't, unfortunately. My all feet, not even one. I have like 5 feet, which everywhere in different places. I'm such an interdisciplinary, so sometimes that hurts me. But I can't answer your question, unfortunately.
No.
I mean, I can see, you know, the visual stuff, for example, probably with that interest in China, I can see the introduction of the fonts, you know, this kind of China influenced fonts, you know, very visual thing that we don't have with any other countries. But when there is many articles, which if they're about the China, they'll use this China influenced font. I mean, it's still Latin script, but, you know, this bamboo, I mean, it didn't happen before. And they were not much used after this, you know, Soviet split. But at that time, somebody introduced them. I don't know how it happened, but this type of thing, which all other script, the fonts in our newspapers were just the same. And this one was very visually different. So that was that I noticed. But on the topic on this, I can't answer your question, sorry.
No problem, Karina.
We need help from the audience or from you. What that might be.
No, I think one more interesting thing that I wanted to ask you was, I think I can safely assume that the revolutionary content was the dominant theme in the children's literature during the period that you're looking at, right?
Yes.
So do you have you come across any kind of disjunction between, what the party emphasized in terms of the revolutionary content and what the illustrators or the editors kind of, produced? Was there any disjunction at any point? And if so, how did the party deal with it? And maybe what was the reason, if there was any disjunction in terms of the content?
Yeah, again, I can't, I haven't looked in such a detail yet, so I can't tell. I mean, with Africa, I know that, but with China, I don't know that yet. I didn't, sorry that I'm bringing Africa every time, but
no, this is not specific to China, Karina.
No, I didn't notice that. I didn't notice that yet, but if probably I will look in more details, I might, but no, nothing yet that would come to my mind as strong as I noticed in other places. So,
okay.
I think it was also well orchestrated, like just, bringing one narrative. So nothing really.
Right, because in China, what you would see is that, that there is a certain party line that, everyone has to follow. If you kind of deviate away from the party line, you would be sent to the camps, labor camps. So that I think that applied to the scientists, the artists, the illustrators, in China. So I was wondering if there are any such parallels that you see in Soviet Lithuania.
Yeah, I wouldn't notice anything outside that pattern. As I said, it was very politically constructed and very ideologically constructed.
Right.
Yeah, nothing. As some topics when I read, in the beginning, it looks like, wow, it's something, more interesting. But then when you read further, it's like, again, it's back to same. So.
Right. All right. Thanks, Karina. I think we are running short of time and we need to wrap up the session. Thank you so much for joining us today, Karina. We had a very interesting presentation. The illustrations were really interesting. We would have loved to have you in person at the Institute, but hopefully next time, if you happen to be in India, we would love to have you at the Institute. So
it is interesting. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, go ahead.
No, it's because we have in our Institute for Asian and Transcultural Study, the amount of scholars working on India is the biggest, but we have the least amount of students. I don't know what's going on, but we have like this big Indian center in our institute, and then we have very little students. So we're like, yeah.
Oh, we would love to have some kind of exchange in case of that works out in the future.
Yeah.
So, all right, Karina, I think we'll wrap it here. Amit, you can take over from here.
Thanks, Ms. Simonson, for your presentation and answer to the queries. With this, we would like to conclude today's session, and I would like to extend thanks to Dr. Simonson and Dr. Adlaka for their precious time. The video of today's discussion will be available on ICS's YouTube platform. Once again, thank you all. Thanks all the participants and the speakers.
Thanks, Amit.